You asked and Imperial listened. Due to extreme popularity and brewer demand, the A44 Kveik blend is being released as a year-round available strain. This blend of 3 proprietary Kveik strains absolutely loves hot fermentations, producing beers bursting with fruity notes of pineapple, guava, and tropical flavors. Use it for your summer blonde ales, your hazy IPA, or anything else you want to have a delectable fruity fermentation character. And A44 is absolutely perfect for those who may not have the ability to precisely control fermentation temperatures. Just pitch your pouch and let her rip. Pick up your homebrew pouch wherever Imperial Yeast is sold and place commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. When making beer, the main source of fermentable sugar is malted grain, usually barley, which has its starches converted into mostly maltose during the mashing process. Now, while maltose is relatively highly fermentable, it influences myriad other things that ultimately impact the character of beer. Hence the reason some resort to using other types of sugars when making certain styles. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And in this episode, contributor Matt Del Fiacco is with me to talk about brewing with simple sugars, namely sucrose and dextrose.
Yeah, and otherwise known as just table sugar and corn sugar. I think I'm really, before doing this experiment, I didn't have too much of a history with brewing with them because I was always what I'm going to refer to throughout this episode as like an all malt purist in that way, where it's like, oh, we got this beer and like anything else, especially table sugar. Table sugar feels lazier to me than corn sugar for some reason. Like I have some rhetorical baggage that I've attributed to those, but both of them are obviously pretty widely used for a lot of different reasons, have different impacts and considerations. So this was both a really fun experiment, but also a really fun topic, I think, for us to dive into.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I haven't really been around long enough to have any personal experience with this, but I've heard from a number of people who have been brewing for a long time, who said that their kits used to come with like a charger pack. I forget exactly what it was called, but basically just a pouch of corn sugar that you would add to the wort prior to pitching your yeast that's purely intended to boost the alcohol in their extract beer. I'm sure my initial concerns with using sugar, which it sounds like you shared, Matt, in my own brewing were at least a little bit influenced by the stories that I heard about how terrible a lot of those beers turned out. But my thinking today is definitely changed. I'm looking forward to talking with you about it, Matt, not only about using simple sugars in beer and some of the differences between, two of the most common ones, sucrose and dextrose, but also the experiment that you performed. Very, very interesting. Well, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. I'm really excited for this month's. Our guest is Dan Pixley, who's one of the main guys behind Milk the Funk's very deserved success. Not only is he the co-host of the Milk the Funk podcast, but he also manages the Milk the Funk wiki, both incredible resources for brewers of sour and funky beers. Dan's going to be taking questions on July 26th, 2020, so be sure to make your pledge before that date to be a part of the event. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your online shopping. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and a review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would really appreciate it. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices. Go see for yourself over at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Thomas Prenner from Vienna, Austria, wrote in with some thoughts on our recent episode where we talked about packaging on Star San foam. He says Star San in Europe is actually not allowed to be sold as a no-rinse sanitizer, so we have the alternative product, ChemiPro San, which I'd never heard of, which is basically the same, foams a lot as well. While I don't think a bit of the stuff does any harm, I've never liked the idea of having something other than beer in my vessels, so I always rinse my fermenters and kegs with tap water after sanitizing. We have really high quality tap water here, so I've assumed it wouldn't be a problem. So far, it's worked out for me. I haven't had an infection in 50 batches or so.
Yeah, definitely I'll go back to the purist in me, like it is a little like, oh, shouldn't use tap water to rinse that. But like, definitely and honestly, I know brewers who do that too and haven't had any issues, like haven't had noticeable infection issues.
Right.
So if something did happen, maybe it was like just either below threshold or not enough to like make a distinguishable impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually share that same concern of, especially like on like packaging on foam, just having that in the beer. I know Star San has a taste because I have tasted it before. So that's another part of it. But yeah, I think if you're having a good experience, I see no problem with continuing the way you're continuing. And if you ever wanted to be a little extra careful, just go with a no rinse sanitizer and wait for it to dry. But otherwise, yeah, just if you're good experiences, man, do you?
Yeah. That's how I feel too. I can't say that I'm necessarily like worried that rinsing out the foam with tap water might lead to a contamination.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm pretty confident it's more safe than it's not. But for me, I just don't see the point of rinsing it if racking onto the foam has no negative impact. And based on the experiment we discussed in that episode, it didn't have a distinguishable impact. So it's just another thing to do if you're going to rinse, and I prefer not doing things unnecessarily. So, but like you said, Matt, Thomas, if you're doing your thing and it works for you, then that's what matters. So thanks for the feedback, Thomas. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Lagers are easily my favorite styles of beer, whether it's yellow and sessionable or dark and boozy. There's just something about lagers that I love. They're very, very approachable, in my opinion. Well, listener Adrian Grisoris of Shavano Park, Texas, also appreciates lager styles, and his wife apparently only drinks Kirin Ichiban, which I absolutely love. I think that's an awesome beer for your wife to enjoy.
It's a great beer.
Yeah. With the goal of brewing a beer his wife enjoys as much as Kirin, Adrian formulated his own recipe, which he calls Lucky Duck Lager, and his wife ended up liking it more than Kirin in a blind side-by-side. Well, I was lucky enough that Adrian sent me a couple bottles to share with my friends.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
That's a nice looking beer.
Good call.
Oh, it's clean.
It's good beer.
That's a nice beer right there.
It's good beer.
Very good.
It's really good.
Nothing lingering afterwards. I could drink a lot of these. Maybe like a Pilsner.
It's a Pilsner. You got.
I get the hiccups. This is good.
Yeah, it's good.
Very good.
I give it 30 jerseys.
Come on, bud.
This is an amazing beer. There's a lot of esters and phenols.
And the overtones?
Caramel? No.
Not for me. It's just a good beer.
No, I was just throwing that out there. Of course not. Of course not. What kind of an idiot would say that? Dude, this is real smooth, real clean, real clear. It's good goddamn beer to me.
I will give it 9 Jersey and Tims.
Oh, well, I guess I don't have to vote then.
What do you got?
I agree with you. 9 Jersey Tims. I think this is a good beer.
Most definitely is.
Yeah, okay, well then let's drink it.
Cheers, buddy.
He ain't no juvenile. He's a grown-ass man.
Well, if it wasn't obvious, Adrian's Lucky Duck Lager was reviewed toward the end of a session, and despite being a bit tipsy and maybe a little tired, the guys really did enjoy it, as did I. Now, I wouldn't say that this was an exact replica of Kirin Ichiban. To my palate, it had almost like a kind of this caramel note that I wouldn't really expect in such a style, but it didn't make the beer bad, just unique. And Adrian did share that he used a touch of Karamunic 3 in the recipe. Not a grain that I associate with lagers, but it worked out, and I'm assuming that's what I was picking up kind of in the finish. He also said that he fermented this beer with Imperial Yeast Harvest at ale temperatures. That's a lager strain, so he fermented it at ale temperatures, and I would never have guessed. The beer was really, really nice, so good job, Adrian.
Yeah, it sounded delicious. Sounded fantastic. I could actually. It's about 1:00 here in Illinois. I could go for like a light lager at this moment. So that sounds very good.
Yeah, Adrian did a great job. And the fact that he kind of did a spin, I think, on one of the things that's great about homebrewing is you can kind of do whatever you want, go whatever direction. So the Karamunic may not have fit into the that Kirin style of lager, but it worked and it was really tasty. And hey, his wife likes it, so he now knows that he can brew a beer that his wife will enjoy drinking. So again, good job, Adrian. If you have a beer that you'd like to have Jersey and Tim review on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we come back from this short break, our focus will be on brewing with different types of sugar. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Put very simply, fermentation is a process whereby yeast metabolizes sugar, then spits out alcohol and CO2 as byproducts. When it comes to beer, the source of this sugar is typically barley malt, which contains starches that are enzymatically converted into sugar, known as maltose, mostly at least during the mashing process. Now, as much as we all love maltose, I don't know whether to say maltose or maltose, but there are times a brewer might be looking for, something a little different in their beer that can be accomplished by adding a certain amount of simple sugars. We've done a few episodes on sugar in the past, so let's start by giving a brief overview of the general role sugar has in brewing.
So, like you said, Marshall, sugar is consumed by yeast to produce both CO2 and alcohol. So, primary role, at least in the production of spirits and alcohol and all that, sugar is converted into alcohol. That's what we want it for. Now, the use of simple sugars in brewing, and especially so simple sugar we refer to is maybe a bit of a misnomer, because we're talking about, in this one, dextrose and sucrose.
Right.
So we're talking about primarily just table sugar, corn sugar, right? Corn sugar being dextrose and table sugar being sucrose.
Right.
So really, when we talk about those two sugars in brewing, they have a pretty rich history just as far as their utilization goes. Mm-hmm. I think modern day we tend to think of sugar, especially table sugars, being used primarily in Belgian styles. At least that's how I tend to think about it, especially things like Belgian Golden Strong.
Yeah, me too. To me, when it comes to using sugar in beer, Belgian styles are what come to mind. I mean, in terms of history, at least.
And when you think about the typical implications of using a sugar, the reasons people say you would use that sugar, it makes sense for some of these these big Belgian beers, especially like a Golden Strong, where I think I would call that, it's lighter, a little bit lighter body, really highly carbonated, and, obviously boozier. And something like table sugar is going to produce that alcohol. And it's almost 100, or it is almost, it might as well be 100% fermentable. So all of it is going to convert into alcohol. Alcohol is less dense than water, so it's going to, in theory, make the body a little bit thinner. Mm-hmm. Or, and another way to think about it, is it's not going to contribute the body that maltose would to a beer. So for the same percentage of alcohol, right? So you get this beer that's higher in alcohol, a little bit less body in theory. It's not going to contribute the same color and aroma and flavor compounds that when we use like malted barley, or even just something like roasted barley that's unmalted, like it's not going to contribute those same characteristics. And so we tend to think of it in those contexts, but really sugar, like these sugars, and especially in the form of like invert sugar or brewing sugar, which those are separate things. And I don't want Ron Pattinson to yell at me, so I'm going to say now they are separate things on the record, as my opinion. But even things so far back as used in the 1800s in England, it was being used in the 1906 amendment for the German purity law. They have you can use sugar in top fermenting beers, and even back in the U.S. Do you remember when that George Washington beer recipe was released like a couple years ago?
Oh yeah.
That thing is mostly molasses.
Yeah,
like there's just a whole bunch of molasses in it, which of course is not like primarily sucrose or primarily corn sugar or table sugar, but it just goes to show like there is a long history of utilizing some of these sugars in brewing, and they come across in a bunch of different styles, and they have their own contributions to beers in different contexts that are able to be leveraged. It's just another mechanism we have to control and a lever we can pull to make better beer.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about maltose and, kind of comparing and contrasting it to these other sugars that we can use in brewing, I don't want to get too deep into like the chemical structure and stuff like that, but let's talk a little bit about the differences, because I do think it's interesting when you break it down on a very simple chemical level. The sugars are different, but they're not that much different. Again, chemically, and I think it's really interesting because they do produce very different outcomes, right? I mean, so my understanding about maltose is that it's a disaccharide formed of two glucose molecules, hence di, right? So it's two glucose molecules bonded together. It's considered a simple sugar, unlike starch, which is a polysaccharide. That's why we use the mashing process for those starches to enzymatically convert into the maltose. But you look at, you were talking about, sometimes you just can't get exactly what you want from malt alone. One of the ways that I think about maltose and why I might choose to use something like table sugar or corn sugar in my beer is that in order to get that maltose out, in order to get enough of the malt sugar that you really want to ferment, you have to use so much malt that it ends up impacting, obviously, your flavor, your body, the aroma of the beer. And so using something, we're using simple, like you said, it's almost a misnomer here, but something simpler like table sugar or dextrose allows you to control that malt character, while also adjusting the ABV lever, if you will, with something that ostensibly doesn't really have a big flavor or aroma impact or mouthfeel impact.
Absolutely. I mean, think of something like a double IPA, and that's maybe one of the more styles that outside of Belgian beers that I think typically people associate using simple sugar.
Absolutely.
Double IPA, where you have to climb up to this 8% roughly alcohol, 7-8%. I've seen some I've seen some higher. Breweries will do, there's a ton of reasons, like people want huge beers. But you do these big double IPAs, and to an extent, you do, of course, want some malt backbone that's going to support the hop character, and you want malt character in there. But do you want so much malt character to get to the percentage alcohol you need, which is also going to make the body, like it's going to contribute body, going to contribute color, flavor, aroma, all that good stuff. Whereas using something like a table sugar or using something like a corn sugar, you can potentially increase that ABV while also thinning out the body just a tiny bit, but also not contributing those other characteristics.
Right. And that's how I think of it as well, is by using these store-bought sugars that are very, very easy to come by. I mean, they're cheap, you are going to get higher alcohol because yeast will very easily and readily ferment those sugars without contributing to those other things. We've all had a double IPA made by a brewery or by a home brewer that was just a malt bomb. And that's not to say that it's bad, but boy,
no, not at all.
There's something refreshing about one that's not like that. One that's really hoppy, has that boozy character, but it doesn't coat your mouth with malty flavor. That's my preference, at least, for a nice double IPA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that way very much so about like the Belgian Golden Strong we talked about earlier. You want that to be crisp. You want it to be, you don't want a heavy malt character to linger in your mouth from something like that.
Right.
But in like we mentioned earlier, the use of sugar isn't really exclusive to those. It's especially as invert sugar shows up in beers like bitters and milds pretty regularly. And even with, the considerations of that German purity law we talked about earlier, allowing it for top fermenting beers, the use of sugar is, I don't want to say style agnostic, because I just think that people associate table sugar with like making a sugar wash, right? Like doing some kind of like home distilling method where you may have to do a lot more work than just, I'm going to add sugar to this and ferment it out. But we've seen, I've done a bunch of beers now with a very high percentage of these sugars and had a good experience with it.
Yeah.
Even some of the other things we've done on the website, like I'm thinking specifically when we did like the dragon's blood recipe, which is mostly just fruit and then like 10 pounds of sugar or something like that. And it ended up being very good. Like it feels real. It feels like distilling because you're adding 10 pounds of just sugar and fermenting it. But the fact that it comes across and it's still like a pleasant character and you're still having something that is like very drinkable and very good. I think that the negative impact of beer might be a tad overstated in terms of how that's used. But like you said, especially we're talking, like you said, for maltose, it is disaccharide, 2 glucose molecules, similar to that. Sucrose, table sugar, also a disaccharide. It is a fructose and a glucose molecule. So a little bit more work there than we would typically see associated with the processing of like dextrose, which is a monosaccharide. It's a glucose molecule. And people say less sweet. And actually, like when we see packs now of like homebrew packs where it's, okay, here's your table sugar, here's what you're going, or here's your carbonating sugar, here's what you're going to use to prime your bottles. I typically do see dextrose, and I see a lot of people advocate for dextrose over sucrose in things like Belgian Golden Strong, even though they are chemically very, very similar, which, it really led us to the experiment, but comes to a point where people are saying things like sucrose end up tasting cidery, that there's almost like a apple fruit-like character in the like a fermented fruit character in the final beer with a large percentage of sucrose, and that just has not really been my experience. It's definitely strange, but they are, like you've mentioned before, really chemically similar in terms of their actual composition. Yeah,
well, so you know as well as I do that in home brewing, there's a lot of stigma attached with certain things. One of them, the fact that I more than occasionally enjoy drinking Miller Lite. People hate that, right? Because that's big beer and whatever. But when I think about sugar, using sugars like sucrose or dextrose, I think a part of the hate that it gets sometimes is because it feels cheap. You're not creating it yourself. You're literally buying C&H at the store or whatever and using that in your beer. And there's something I think some people view as that, in part, again, that's just cheap. It's like cheating. But then again, corn sugar. What do we know is used in American light lagers produced by these big brewing companies?
Right.
Corn. People relate that. Or sucrose. The primary source for sucrose is sugar cane or sugar beets, one or the other. Again, that doesn't sound like something I think, it doesn't sound appealing to have in your beer, or
right. Well, definitely. I mean, absolutely. I do think there is this component of it feels cheap, right? And I think one of the reasons I think that is because I have talked about feeling that way when I've made a couple things in the past that use a high percentage of sugar.
Yeah.
But I think that's true, but it's something important to consider is that sugar, while cheap right now, has not always been cheap.
No.
That is new. That is a new thing, that sugar is this cheap. And we have this history of sugar ending up in beer. And it's not always because, this is cheaper than barley, because that's historically not always true. Mm-hmm. Sugar's price has fluctuated so strongly, and especially sugar cane, like as a primary cash crop, there is a lot to say for the role of sugar, and especially invert sugars and brewing sugars, in their role as primary ingredients to beer that need to be considered in the same way that we would consider like a flaked oats or a roasted barley or just straight up base malts. It is, I get now that there is the sense of, it's just cheap of you to do. That is a very recent idea. It's a very new thing.
Sugar, sugar used to be a luxury. Only rich people could have, and it was one of those things that it was a status symbol if you could have sugar. So it is cheap nowadays, and again, I think some people view using it in your brewing as kind of a cheapening of the brewing process. I don't really care about that.
No, the all malt purism is, I think, I'd be curious, like if I had time to like dig into the history of that idea, because I do think it's very interesting in terms of that. But absolutely, there is room for sugars like this historically in a lot of styles. Obviously, not all styles, and we're also just to be clear, because I'm not making the argument, let's replace 50% of all base malts with table sugar. It's more that this is just something at our disposal that is appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. So real quick, I don't want to get too hung up on this, but you've mentioned invert sugar a few times. Can you explain a little bit what exactly invert sugar is compared to, say, just standard, granular sucrose or dextrose?
Yeah. Sorry about that. So invert sugar is typically sucrose that has been broken down and in theory is easier to ferment than sucrose itself. So sucrose being a disaccharide, fructose and glucose. Typically when you add, I think it's like citric acid typically that's used to make invert sugar, that will break that down and it's easier to ferment theoretically. And then also huge, a big you can make invert sugar that has been caramelized. You can get it within different shades of color, different degrees of caramelization, and that can contribute different characteristics to beer based on how you have treated that invert sugar itself, as opposed to just straight up adding pure sugar. And then this is being distinct from brewing sugar, which brewing sugar is made from raw cane sugar and has things in it other than like a really refined sugar that's been processed and broken down. Right. So obviously you and I, we're really, for this experiment, are primarily talking about dextrose and sucrose, but invert sugar would be another fun experiment, I think. And I think just recently some suppliers in the US are providing brewing sugar, which would be a cool thing to dive into as well. Yeah. But yeah, so that's the general of invert sugar, is that it's a broken down sucrose that you can do. It's again, like it's another layer of control, that it's more work to a certain extent, unless you just buy it pre-made to whatever color or caramelization that you want. But it is another just ingredient to consider.
Yeah. So, okay. Now thinking about sucrose versus dextrose and the differences between them, you mentioned it earlier, but the biggest issue that I heard about using table sugar, sucrose in brewing, was that if you use too much, which the amounts vary, that people will tell you it's gray. Yeah. But if you use too much, that it will impart or create this sort of like apple cider note, which is not something I want in my beer at all. And so I'll admit, I was kind of scared to use sucrose for a while. What now? But it was always safe to use dextrose, and I don't know if that's because it's a monosaccharide, if it's just that single glucose molecule. I don't know why people made that argument, but I am curious about other differences between sucrose and dextrose when we're thinking about the context of using it in beer.
Yeah, I mean, so both are 100% fermentable, so good sign there. I think probably the primary difference is that corn sugar contributes 42 points per gallon of fermentable sugar rather than 46 points per gallon, which is what table sugar contributes. Right. So corn sugar contributes just less overall gravity points of the same, I believe. It just contributes overall of the same weight than table sugar would, but they're both 100% fermentable. And as far as the other differences, they're chemically so similar. Like obviously, as a disaccharide, potentially, like during fermentation, it needs to become fructose and glucose to be consumed. Yeah. Other than that, They're very, very, very similar. I had this amazing conversation when I did the test for this, and Nancy, who owns What's Brewing Supply in Palatine, Illinois, and she's the best, and support her shop if you live near that area. Her husband she colloquially refers to as the sugar guy, because it's what he does actually for his job.
Really?
He chemically works with sugar and just knows a ton about sugar. And I was talking to her and by proxy him through her about this experiment, and he was just like blown away by these beers because chemically they are so similar to one another.
Yeah. So you mentioned it earlier as well, and I think it's an interesting thing an interesting point when we're looking at the differences between sucrose and dextrose, that dextrose is apparently 50 to 75% less sweet tasting than sucrose. And my grandma, she's long since gone now, but she used to use dextrose in her coffee, and I didn't know why. I remember thinking, I'd already been brewing for a while, and thinking, first off, why? I don't get it. But now I'm wondering if it's not because of because she had insulin issues and she wasn't diabetic, but I just wonder if maybe that if that less sweet thing also has a different, is like processed by your body differently, maybe.
I have no idea there. One I can't help you with.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Matt. Yeah.
Me
either. But it is interesting because the reason I say that is because then you could kind of extrapolate from that, and potentially yeast treat these sugars a little bit differently, even though they're both 100% fermentable. It doesn't seem a far stretch to think that one or the other might create a perceptible difference compared to the other one. And I think it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, I actively avoided using table sugar for years out of fear of this cidery thing. And then I was brewing a beer. God, I think it must have been 4 or 5 years ago. It wasn't even that long ago. And I thought I had a couple pounds of dextrose sitting up in my brewing shelf, and I didn't. And so I'm halfway through the boil, and I got to add sugar to this double IPA I was making, right? And so I was like, fine, I guess I'm going to do it, and I went and I grabbed the equivalent amount of table sugar, and it wasn't a comparison, but I'll tell you, that beer came out pretty doggone good. And I did not get any cider character at all from it.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that was one of the catalysts for, or just like our shared experience in terms of sugar is one of the catalysts for when we ended up doing this experiment, is because I love Belgian Golden Strong Ale. It's one of the styles that if I were ever to, like, say I wanted to really land on like 5 or 6 styles and do them as best as I could, Belgian Golden Strong would be one of them. And I had always used table sugar, and I had never experienced anything cidery. And just like as we were doing research and as I was looking into it, it crossed my mind that maybe there's something to this, or maybe there is enough of a reason that people are recommending dextrose over, or recommending just corn sugar over table sugar. And, otherwise I was so skeptical at the time because I'd never experienced those negative aspects of table sugar. But once I'd started thinking about it, I was, okay, maybe I just never picked it up, or maybe I never thought about it, or maybe the fact that it's the yeast covering it up or something. So I was super excited to try it, and I shared your experience, and after doing this, I'm still in the same boat. So,
well, and there is that, phenomenon wherein, in isolation, it's very difficult sometimes to notice if something is having a negative or positive impact, which is why we do experiments. It's why we do these comparisons, and it's what makes it interesting. Now, before we move into talking about the experiment that you performed, let's talk a little bit about how you go about using sugar in your brewing. Now, obviously, if you're doing bottle conditioning, or if you're naturally carbonating in the keg, that's a different topic. Yeah. We're not going to focus on that. In my experience, I typically will add sugar with about 10 minutes left in the boil. And I don't know why I don't add it sooner or later, but 10 minutes left in the boil is just kind of the point where I do it.
Yeah, I think that is, obviously you are then boiling it for a little bit. So if there's any kind of contamination risk, you're dealing with that, which is good. The only thing I would say in terms of consideration that I typically see is just to make sure that if you are adding sugar, if you have sugar in your recipe and you go into Beersmith and you're like, okay, this thing has 20% or 15%, just a large percentage of sugar in it, make sure you account for hop utilization when that's getting added. Just because gravity differences could potentially impact the way in which hops are utilized during the boil. So thinking about that, that said, I bet you probably wouldn't be able to tell.
That's my thought.
I really don't know if you would be able to. This is the theorist in me speaking, that this is like technically accurate. I don't know that we'd be able to tell. It'd be, I think, probably pretty difficult. But there it is. Gravity will impact the ways in which hops are utilized. I usually end up adding the sugar, I think, also at the end, or I've done it during fermentation. So yeah. I know we talked about this back in episode 41. I know there's been, I think, a couple experiments on it now, just feeding the sugar during fermentation. We won't go too deep into it, but just either as a lump sum where you add a bunch of sugar at once, and we've already started to reduce osmotic pressure because fermentation has started, more yeast, and then just kind of stepping in, especially if you add nutrients at this time, stepping in the sugar can potentially be beneficial for fermentation, or just doing small chunks of that sugar over time so that the osmotic pressure never gets too high, and you're able, the yeast is under less stress to continue to process that sugar. So there's definitely some couple different ways to do it. I usually just do it during the boil because I think it's easier to set it and forget it. And also, I've never really had too much of a bad experience with yeast being, too stressed. I've just, yeast starters and modern yeast and oxygen are all helpful in that regard.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And the, there are, I think it was one batch I made a few years ago where I added the sugar up front, right at the 60-minute mark. So it was throughout the entire boil. Mm-hmm. The beer was fine. I didn't have any issues. The concerns that I've read that people have about that is that you can caramelize the sugars. I just don't think that's happening, personally. I haven't seen that. It wasn't like my beer was darker or tasted more caramelly. Mm-hmm. But that is something that people are concerned about. But, the question is, do these different types of sugars, sucrose and dextrose, result in noticeable differences when used in the boil, or can they be used interchangeably? Results from an experiment on this very topic after these words from our sponsors.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Attention beer drinkers and thinkers, put that mash paddle down for a second. Let me ask you, do you like to cook outside? Do you love the smell of charcoal and barbecue?
If you've answered yes to any of those questions, I think you should check out the Grill Coach podcast, where we discuss all things barbecue and grilling.
Join us on our mission where we aim to learn, teach, and share the amazing world of grilling and barbecue. So grab a home brew and join us. We think you'll find our perspective on the world of outdoor cooking unique.
You can find us online at thegrillcoach.com and follow us on Facebook, Instagram at The Grill Coach.
From this home brewer to you, get out there and grill.
I've come to accept that brewers hold some pretty strong opinions about a lot of seemingly insignificant things, but this idea that different types of sugars can impart unique qualities to beer was one that I didn't really struggle too much with, only because their chemical makeups are different. Now, that said, given the amounts of typically used in beer, in a batch of beer, it also seemed unlikely to have much of an impact. So I was kind of waffling there. That's exactly what you aim to explore with your experiment, though, Matt.
Yeah, like I said, Belgian Golden Strong Ale, one of my favorites. And so any tweak I can make, especially with the percentages that we are using sugar in styles like that. And I think for this one, it was pretty high. It was like 17%. It's not too far of a stretch to say that the kind of sugar between dextrose and sucrose could potentially have an impact if they are very chemically similar, but looking at it, maybe there is something to it. So when we went out to do this, Belgian Golden Strong Ale, just because that is one, favorite style, love brewing it. 2, uses a really high percentage of sugar just as a part of its process, its normal process. So this ended up being a beer, the 1080 OG, estimated final gravity of around 1007, leaving us at almost 10% alcohol, 30 IBUs, 90-minute boil. I know it was a big beer. It was
Belgian Golden, very strong.
Yes, exactly. I like that. It was about 83% pills and 17% sugar. So it's about like 2.3 or 2.4 pounds were used during this experiment between the corn sugar and the table sugar. This is one area where I think it was interesting to see so we did, I'll go into this in a second, but like we mentioned earlier, dextrose and sucrose, they contribute different points of gravity for just by the same weight, and we did use 2.4 pounds for each, meaning that they would have a different level of fermentability, but a different contribution to fermentable sugars. But we'll get into that in a sec. But the rest of the recipe, 60-minute Magnum edition, 15-minute Saaz edition of about 30 grams, which I love Saaz and Belgian Golden Strong Ales. When it just late edition, it really comes through. It's so delicious. And I used Imperial Yeast Sonome, which I've had. It's a really clean fermenting Belgian strain. I've had some good experiences with it.
Yeah, it's a great strain. I've used it as well. Now, one of the things also that you did that I think is interesting to note is you mashed at 148 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 C, which is pretty. That's lower end. You're really favoring that beta amylase so that you are just doing everything you can to make this wort fermentable, right? I mean, to really, really dry out.
Yeah, and this is total personal opinion. I want a Belgian Golden Strong Ale to be dry.
Oh yeah.
That is and that's another reason for the sugar to you want it to be a little bit lighter of body, higher carbonation, and just dry on the I love that beer. So mash at 148, like you said, pretty low. I ended up adding the sugar for these around the 30-minute mark. Mm-hmm. So after I'd done my 60-minute edition, 30 minutes in, add a bunch of sugar to each of these. Ran them through a counterflow chiller, put them in, waited. I think I gave them about a day just to get to pitching temperatures, which was still pretty low to start off. So I pitch my Belgian beers around where I ferment my ales, which is like 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius. For both of these, and this is where we can get into those points, the gravity points per gallon, the Dextrose batch ended up actually being spot on. It was 1080 OG, and the Sucrose batch, predictably, was about 1082. So it did contribute a little bit more sugar. Not more sugar, but it contributed more points per gallon than the Dextrose.
Which was completely expected, right? I mean,
as expected, and it was by design, and I think it's something it's something we could maybe look at if we ever do a repeat of this experiment, especially like during these COVID times, doing it so that it's different volumes of sugar, but to the same gravity would also be interesting. I think it's just another way to take it. I wanted to make sure that the volumes of sugar were equal. And so that unfortunately was just going to be the case, that it resulted in a different original gravity.
Yeah. Now I just want to, sometimes I think for effect, when you talk about pounds of sugar, for one, we've got international listeners who find it hard to relate with what 2.4 pounds are. But that is equivalent to 38 ounces of sugar or 1.1 kilos of either sugar. That is a lot of sugar.
It was a lot, yeah.
to be adding to a beer. I mean, I've never added that much to a beer. So we really were looking. I mean, if there was going to be a difference, we were going to find it, and that was kind of the point of you adding this much. Now, you said the Sucrose batch had 1082 OG. The Dextrose had 1080 OG. After 4 days of fermentation, you ramped up that temp from 64 or 18C to 80F or 27C and left them alone for a little while before taking final gravity readings. And I think, again, predictably, there was a little bit of a difference there.
There was. So the Dextrose ended up being 1007, like we said earlier, and then Sucrose ended up being 1010. So about 0.003 higher. And, I think you mentioned, like, predictably, I'm actually a little surprised by that. I had thought that the remaining sugar the additional sugar would still ferment out to a similar final gravity.
Yeah.
Given just the temperature in these things, given how fermentable those sugars are, given how low I mashed, all that stuff, I had actually anticipated them probably being around terminal, but 0.003, it, like you mentioned, it's not. It's about as expected. It makes sense that it started a little bit higher. It makes sense that it finished a little bit higher. But I had expected it to be a little lower, but it's all right. It ended up where it ended up.
Well, and when you think about attenuation, they attenuated about the same. I mean, they're both of them. I don't know what the percentage was, but 1082 down to 1010 versus 1080 down to 1007. That's really, really close in terms of total attenuation. So.
Yeah. Well, per usual process, I transferred these beers into my sanitized CO2 flushed kegs, put them on gas, did a period of burst carbonation, and then a week of just conditioning and sort of fine tuning that carbonation to where I wanted it, which for a Belgian Golden Strong, very high, lots of CO2. And which is another thing I think that's interesting about this experiment, that we could maybe, if we ever did do a redo, potentially a different style with a bunch of sugar in it, is just the fact that like CO2 helps reduce your perception of sweetness, like on your palate, like carbonic acid. And so,
well, and you're making me think. One of the things about Belgian Golden Strong, which this show is not about Belgian Golden Strong, but one of the things about that, we could do a show on that for sure
if you'd like.
But it is that it's refreshing, and I think a lot of people, when you think of high gravity beers, really boozy alcoholic beers, you don't really associate that with refreshing. But one of the things, in my opinion, that adding sugar or using sugar in place of malt can do is really amplify that refreshingness, that you want to have another sip. It's not something to sit around a campfire and sip, you want to drink it. And that to me at least is one of the big pros of using sugar in brewing. So
yeah. So I ended up serving this beer to the Pale Homebrew Club here in Illinois and Club Wort, and both of them were just absolutely the best. I think I've talked about Pale before, that I've been there quite a few times. Club Wort, this was the first time I'd been there, and they were just so much fun. This is actually where I talked to Nancy too. Of course, I've seen her at other places, but just the best experience. So thank you again, guys, for letting me come do this. Thank you all.
Yeah, seriously, it's awesome of these homebrew clubs to let us come and crash their meetings for data collection. Now, you're going to talk about the results here, but I'm really interested first off in whether you could tell these beers apart before you served them to people. Were you able to tell the beers apart? Did they taste the same to you, or were they different?
So much to my surprise, I was able to tell these beers apart pretty reliably. I actually thought the beer that was made with sucrose, I thought that it seemed a little harsher. It seemed that there was more aroma flavor characteristic than the beer that was made with just dextrose. And I actually prefer the dextrose version a lot more. Just because I associate Belgian Golden Strong ales with it's almost like drinking champagne in a way. And I really did not like the sweeter characteristics that I perceived in that sucrose beer. And so I actually got it 5 for 6 times in a semi-blind triangle test. So I still look back at this one and think, could it have been something else? And I think we do that a lot, especially internally. And that's maybe something that we don't talk about too much, is like whenever we are just reflecting, this is one of the ones where I look back, I'm like, man, was there something I could have done or something I did differently? And it's one I would love to do again. But in this beer, when I did it this time in this example, 5 for 6, I got it, and I just did not love the sucrose version.
Now 5 for 6, okay, that's really good odds. I mean, it's
pretty good.
You can pretty reliably distinguish these beers, but you weren't perfect. Which the only reason I point that out is because if they were so drastically different, then yes, you would.
You probably would be. Yeah,
you would expect to see 100%. Your ability to distinguish them at 100%. Now, I hear what you're saying. We often question whether something else may have played a role in the experiment beers that we brew. But that's part of the reason we serve them to tasters, right? To participants, is because they're unbiased. As in terms of not knowing what the variable is. So you did that. You served it to 30 participants, out of which 15 would have needed to identify the odd beer out, a full half, in order for us to say that these results were significant. How many in the end were able to do that?
We would have needed 15. Like you said, we had 18 people make the accurate selection, which means that in this example of it, in this specific experiment with this sample of people, 18 people were able to reliably distinguish the Belgian Golden Strong Ale made with corn sugar from one made with table sugar. So pretty good. 18 over 15 is a little bit higher than we usually see. 30 was a decent sample. I was happy to get that many. As far as preference goes, though, unlike me, which I had like a very clear preference for the one with dextrose, we actually had a split where 8 people preferred the dextrose beer, 10 people preferred the sucrose beer.
Yeah, I mean, we see that often, right? Preference is very subjective, especially when you don't know, which beer is which or what the variable even was. So that doesn't surprise me as much as the fact that people were actually able to tell these apart. I did not expect that at all. I in my head, I was like, I'm so glad to get this one out of the way because I've used table sugar. It doesn't make a difference, and here you go. You got data sitting right. And there's always a likelihood that there's a false positive. I get that. But of course, the fact that you were able to tell them apart, the fact that 18 out of 30 people were able to distinguish these beers, that is so incredibly interesting to me and went against everything that I'd come to believe over the last few years as I've increased my sugar usage in my brewing. So fascinating experiment with fascinating results, man.
Same. Yeah. Thank you. And I agree. Like definitely I went into this thinking there's no chance. Like I said, I used sucrose pretty much all the time for all of my Belgian Golden Strong ales. But then, and that was just like an idea. But then I was looking back at like my old recipes, and it turns looking back, I actually used dextrose more than I thought I used sucrose. I thought I used sucrose all the time, and I was went into this I always use table sugar. Looking back at recipes, I almost never used it. I ended up using dextrose all the time, and I don't know why that is, but. I would love to do this one again. I would love to do this one again. I think it would be really, really fascinating to do again. And like you said, man, you know what? Here's what I will say. I didn't think either of them were necessarily cider-like. I do think that there was some fruitier character to the sucrose beer that I didn't like as much. I don't know that I would associate it with cider. It was more like a weird harshness that I detected.
You were tasting that fructose, man. That's what it was.
Tasting maybe.
Because fructose is fruit sugar, I believe. I mean, that's the typical source of it. But yeah, I was going to ask about the cidery thing if you ended up getting that, because I have used table sugar way more than I've used dextrose at this point because it's easier for me to get. We have a bunch at home. I've never, ever gotten cidery. I've never gotten an apple character from it. All I get is what you'd expect, kind of that, a reduced mouthfeel, more alcohol, and no flavor contribution. Now, your results are telling me that maybe if I'd compared it to a same beer brewed with Dextrose, I might have tasted a difference. I have not done that, and because of my experience, as fascinating as these results are, I'm going to keep using Sucrose because it's easier for me to source. It's cheaper in the end. But I mark my words, I will try using Dextrose. Just again, with my mindset now is a little bit different because of these results, and seeing if maybe there isn't something there. I mean, I again, so interesting because I thought they would taste exactly the same.
I know, man. Looking back at it and looking back at like how much I was using Dextrose versus like my perceived use of Sucrose, I think when we do this one again, which I might, we'll see. I could probably get a brew day in after this. I'll probably end up doing like an Imperial American lager or something, like that where 15%, 20% sugar, and let's see now whether or not that comes across. Let's push this one a little bit. But yeah, it was a blast to do. I was so surprised by the results. And honestly, like my recipes, I'd been building off of Dextrose. And I didn't really see a reason to change that other than the fact that I've now used Sucrose in a couple different beers. Like I used it in an Imperial Stout the other month. And just like trying to figure out where my line is in terms of gravity contribution and actual like perceptible characteristics. And I still haven't noticed that cider characteristic. I also haven't necessarily noticed that harshness characteristic from some of them. So I would love to do this one again. I think it'd be a blast, but this one was one of the more surprising experiments we've done, I think.
Yeah. Very interesting one. And our readers definitely thought so as well. We've got some feedback to get through here. First one comes from Ben Morgan, who said, interesting to see there's a difference. Aren't Belgian ales normally made with sucrose in the form of candy sugar rather than dextrose? I would have thought dextrose, aka glucose, would have a similar effect to rice, which yields starch in the mash that's broken down entirely to glucose.
I don't know whether or not it would be like, so I think that starch conversion is something that is maybe outside of like the current perspective. That's an interesting position though, but yeah, so Belgian beers, definitely the form of candy sugar or just like candy or the syrups. And I know that table sugar is typically associated with those Belgian beers. As far as them being different, I agree. Super interesting. And I'm not quite sure why it would be given like how chemically similar they are. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely spot on. Like table sugar is traditionally used for a lot of styles. So I don't see anything wrong, even in spite of this experiment specifically, which again, of course, it's one experiment, that you wouldn't use sucrose. Like just because they're different, preference was still split for a lot of people. So exactly. I would continue just to use table sugar if it's both A, more accessible, like you said, Marshall, and B, you feel better traditionally and like your own perception.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree with you. Next comment comes from Lee, who says, I've been struggling to identify the source of an apple note in my beers. Perhaps it's from the sucrose I've been bottle priming with? I am
wildly hesitant to say that would be the case, which it's probably too late now. I hope we responded to this one when it came up. That is an interesting perspective, and kind of like we said, I've been using sucrose in other situations lately, and I've of course bottle sugared with sucrose. I really don't think that would be associated with the sugar. Like you're using such a low percentage of that sucrose, that I would be hard pressed to say that that's actually the case. I would actually point more towards some other factor, like an acetaldehyde characteristic, as opposed to the sugar contribution.
Yeah, and even the whole acetaldehyde tasting like, and we did a whole episode on this, but tasting like apples or whatever, that's not how I've perceived acetaldehyde. I've heard that that's what people, it's like a green apple skin or whatever. To me, acetaldehyde's more like cut grass. It's that it's got an earthier thing to it more than just cidery or apple. But yeah, the amount of sugar you're using to bottle condition to prime your bottles with is just so low. It'd be hard for me.
I would really be hard pressed to say that's the case.
To say with any confidence that's what's causing your cidery thing. I had a buddy a while ago who had an issue with a cidery off flavor in their beer, and it sucked. But what we ended up figuring out is it was a contamination. I mean, and contaminants, bacteria, all the various bacteria and wild yeast out there can create some really interesting characteristics and flavors. And, it sucks to have to accept that you've got a contamination somewhere. But once you rid yourself of that, that's what I'd be focusing on, Lee.
I'd also just make sure, and this is just an aside, like make sure you're giving the beer enough time to ferment. That could potentially be a problem if it is something similar to, if it is acetaldehyde. Just make sure that you're giving it plenty of time to be converted during fermentation. Exactly. That'd just be another just to rule out that that's the case.
Yeah, 100%. So next comment comes from Peter Novotny. He says, cidery off flavor is due to fermenting too much simple sugar. It does not matter if it is sucrose or dextrose. So the link between harsh sucrose and cidery-like that you're trying to see is really not there, and it is mostly coincidence. There's really no ground here to support such a claim, especially when these flavors are perceived differently. My opinion is that it can be simple as that. Sometimes it is hard to perfectly repeat two conditions in two fermenters at home, even side by side. So it sounds like Peter here is questioning your ability to control the experiment here, Matt.
That's fair.
Could be, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree, though. I would, so this is not me disagreeing with that comment. This is me saying that typically when I see people mention the cidery off characteristics, it is specifically in response to the use of sucrose as opposed to dextrose.
That's what I've read as well.
That is more so, and that is not to say that he's wrong, but it is to say that seems to be the conventional wisdom that's kind of passed around homebrew forums, right? Is that it is the result of sucrose. Now, obviously, calling into question like my own ability to control these side by side is totally legitimate, very fair. And I would way more than encourage like anyone who's done it themselves just to talk about their experiences and try it yourself. And if you do taste a difference, use which one you prefer. If you don't taste a difference, do whichever one is easier or better for you. And I do, obviously, I think all of us, like we do our best to control everything we can, but I would never say that I'm anywhere close to perfect. So that's okay.
I'm confident in your abilities. I think, I'd be curious where Peter got his source, that sucrose and I've only ever heard sucrose associated with the cidery off flavor, but I'm not saying I'm an expert on everything, but I've been around all of this stuff for a while.
Maybe so. It might be that he's thinking that it's just potentially due to the fact that, you are fermenting almost 100% fermentable, chemically similar sugars that aren't really contributing too much beyond, like they're not contributing things in the way that maltose contributes things. And as a high percentage is potentially impact, like there's more osmotic pressure and all these things. Like I get where it could like potentially come from. Yeah. But yeah, it's just not what I've seen out there, and it very much so could be the case, but we'll see. Yeah.
Final comment comes from Reddit user Snipe09. Of all the experiment results I've read, somehow this one surprised me more than any others. I've always assumed since the sugars fermented out almost completely that there would be no noticeable difference.
Yeah, I went in kind of with a similar position that they were going to be so chemically similar, and I think actually in discussions with people afterwards, that was one of the more surprising aspects of it, was that they are so chemically similar. But that said, I mean, in that higher percentage, they are obviously different chemically, even though they are similar. And it could be, and I've seen a lot of speculation sort of on all sides of it, where it's okay, maybe it's because one's a monosaccharide, one's a disaccharide, and that might have to do with how something is influenced or how yeast character develops during fermentation because of that. I've seen unsubstantiated claims all over the place. And so I'm not going to plant my flag on any of them, but it surprised the hell out of me too. It's definitely one I would like to see done again. But I can at least say that these beers, for whatever reason, definitely tasted different.
Yeah. I'm with you, Snipe09. These results were very, very surprising to me. I didn't expect it. And he makes the point that they both fermented out pretty much 100%. So, you said something about yeast character, and that's the only layman's explanation that I can come up with is maybe the way the yeast fermented the monosaccharide versus the disaccharide created some perceptible difference. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's something about the types of sugars imparting flavor, but they were different, and you tasted the difference, and so did a panel of participants. And I think that's fascinating. So, well, that does bring us to the end of this episode. Is there anything else on sucrose and dextrose that you'd like to say before we wrap things up, Matt?
No, nothing I haven't said already. I think just like as to reiterate those key points is I'd like to see this one done again. Definitely one I think that I was really surprised by, and I think given a lot of the feedback on it would be just fascinating to see this done in a different context. I think probably a good closer is that I am still using Dextrose in my Belgian Golden Strong Ale just based on this experiment. So maybe it is worth trying again so I don't have to keep buying corn sugar.
Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, I've not done a side-by-side, but I've made plenty of beers using both table sugar and Dextrose. And honestly, I haven't noticed any detriment. So I'm going to stick with Sucrose until I'm proved myself otherwise. All right, don't forget to click the link in the description of this episode to learn more about the experiment we discussed. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.